Hello and welcome back to the Veterans Lounge podcast. I am your host, Miguel Mata, and today I have a very special guest, someone who is very modest in the accolades and the prestige surrounding his military service. His name is Marek Rudak. Now, if that name sounds a little peculiar, it's because Marek wasn't born in the U.S. He was born in Poland. Marek is a Polish immigrant who moved to this country in his teens and decided that he, like most vets, he needed something bigger. He needed something greater than what he was experiencing. And as Marek will share with us as well, there's something a little bit more personal behind his reason for joining the service. But Marek is a West Point grad. He is airborne. He's an airborne ranger assigned to the 82nd Airborne, Iraqi war veteran, combat veteran. He has a whole wealth of experience to share with us. And today he shares some very unique perspectives behind his upbringing, his service in the military, and also what came after following his transition into the civilian life. And now Marek Rudak. All right, welcome back to the Veterans Lounge podcast. Miguel Mata, your host once again, and today I have a very special guest, Mr. Marek Rudak, and I believe I did pronounce that correctly.
Yes, great job, Miguel.
Yeah, I've been practicing.
Yes,
Marek is someone that I met through a previous project, and I had to get him on because he's got. Well, I mean, you've got so much experience. You've got so much experience, personal experience on top of your military experience that and we probably won't even get a chance to get into that. But I wanted to make you a part of this project, and I'm glad that you agreed to spend a little time with me and spend a little time with the veterans who might be listening, because you really do have, I think, a unique perspective to the military, to the military experience, your own experience, and I want to thank you for coming on.
Well, my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on and being, I guess, second episode in your podcast. I feel very honored that I'm, not the first one, but one of the first ones in the shoot.
Your military journey kind of makes its way through some pretty prestigious lanes throughout the Army, and I'm curious, how that came about for you.
Sure. Yeah, no. The funny thing about prestigious, it's always relative,
Okay.
When you compare yourself to somebody else, or it's all relative. But I definitely appreciate the compliment. Yeah. So with me, it's a bit of a unique story, as you can notice from my accent. I wasn't born in the United States. I was actually born in Poland, time of communism, towards the tail end. And so I experienced what it looked like, especially as it was in disintegrating. It's not that we were starving, anything like that, but just selection wasn't there. You always had just basic foods, and anything kind of extra or fancy, you had to spend a lot of time in line. For example, oranges, things like oranges. These days we go to any store, you pick up oranges just like that for pennies sometimes, depending on the season. But I remember as a kid, the only way we could get oranges was from Cuba, because that was one of those few communist countries, and we get them very rarely. I had to wait in line, and so that really made me appreciate things. Or just the fact that I would wear the same clothes that my colleagues that my classmates wore to school, same shoes, because there was no variety. Because in a communist system, there's no reason to be innovative, competitive. So it was just very utilitarian. So that definitely really made me appreciate the blessing of being in the United States. First of all, just moving from a communist country to a country with so much freedoms and so many blessings. And growing up, I didn't have a father figure. the the thing that was very weird back then, unfortunately it's not very weird now, but especially back in communist Poland, is my dad didn't live with us, which back then there was nobody else I can think of in my out of the people that I knew that happened. So it was always very awkward that I had a dad, but he didn't live with us. And my dad passed away when I was 10. And the sad thing is that when he passed away, I didn't really cry at the funeral just because I don't know him. I mean, it's really hard to mourn after somebody you don't really know. And the unfortunate thing that happened is my father figure was a very abusive grandfather. What happened is that, especially back then, housing wasn't very plentiful. It was very hard to get a mortgage, get a house. So typically, you ended up living with your parents. And so what ended up happening is that me, my mom, and my grandma lived in the same small apartment as my grandfather, and grandfather was my father figure, if you will. And he was just very, very critical, very abusive. Like the words that he used, I mean, even to this day, when I think about the things that he said, I cringe. It's like, I think all of us experience that. There's that one person that says things, and the way they say things, they really stick and they really hurt. And that was basically my grandfather on a daily basis. And so I didn't feel as safe at home. I always try to stay quiet, and it was hard in a small apartment because I was afraid of being a target. And so what happened is that after my dad passed away, my mom remarried. And so when I was 13, she moved to the United States. When I was 14, I joined her. And I'll never forget the day she picked me up at the San Francisco airport. I look at her, and she's got a big belly. She's 7 months pregnant. Obviously, as an adult, people get married, they have kids. That's pretty logical. But at the time, I was 14. I didn't expect that. And from that moment on, right, wrong, or indifferent, I felt like a fifth wheel in my brand new family, because here's my mom. She's married. She's about to have a kid, and at the time I was envious of my single siblings that they have this perfect family, and I just felt like a misfit. And so that's why I really focused on accomplishments, and especially that one in my heart. Growing up, ever since I can remember, my grandfather always criticized me. It made me feel like I wasn't adequate, and so I set on this path to prove my worth. And the thing about it is that if I had to do my life all over again, without a doubt, I would have still joined the military. I would have went to West Point. But the reality of the situation is, at the time, I was craving for validation. And then I remember seeing all these movies. Typically you have some military vet or military guy is a hero. And I thought to myself, man, if I go in the military or go to West Point, man, I'll finally have that confidence. And after that, everything will be easy peasy, because that will give me that internal confidence that I always missed. And so that's what led me to West Point. I'm super blessed to have been accepted. I had a good academic record, but I'm still looking back at it. I'm not really quite sure how it happened, because I wasn't a very likely candidate. I mean, a lot of my classmates, they had brothers, sisters, dads in the armed forces, and here I was, somebody who at the time didn't even spend 4 years in the United States. And all by the way, there was another story with me trying to get my paperwork straight with citizenship to make sure that I can actually start with my class, and that's another story that we don't have time to get into. But the thing about accomplishments, it's like, it's never enough, right? So yeah, it was great that I got accepted, but it was like, well, what's the next thing? So I really threw, like, the way West Point works, you ranked on everything: academics, physical, military, and I did very well. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, and again, it was enough. So I was like, at the time I was a computer science major, and I thought to myself, well, the logical thing for somebody in the Army, if you have a computer science degree or anything to do with like electrical engineering, is to do signal code, which is basically communications, computers, kind of the things that help the military talk. And obviously it's actually grown a lot since, because there's the cyber warfare aspect too as well. So that would have been kind of the logical choice. But then I was on my way to prove myself. So I thought, well, okay, that's nice and dandy, but I don't want my kids to know that their dad, just work on the keyboard in the Army. So I was like, why don't I go to infantry? Because then you get a chance to go to Ranger School, go to airborne school. And then that's what I did. I ended up in 82nd Airborne Division. And again, obviously, if I had to do it over again, I would have done things differently while in the military. But don't get me wrong, I am super blessed, and I would have gone in the military all over again in a snapshot if given a choice to do it all over again.
The explanation kind of that you gave there at the beginning, that was part of your realization that your military journey, at least the way you, at least the way you understand it, was about validation. It was
Right.
about validation, feeling some sort of validation that you were, worthy of you, right? Interesting. That's really interesting, and I really like. I don't know. I've heard that story, not your specifically, but people want to emulate what they've seen on TV, right? And they say, hey,
Right.
yeah, this looks like fun. And of course, being young men, right, all full of piss and vinegar, if you will,
to use nice words.
And they want to be a part of it all, but they really have no idea. The movies are just that, the movies. They don't capture what that experience and which you have firsthand experience as a combat veteran. I'm honestly not entirely certain what direction to go with this, only that as someone who does not have combat experience, I don't want to feel like I'm exploiting you in any way. But what was that like? I mean, as far as like your personal story, here you are, you went to West Point, you went to the 82nd Airborne, you're a Ranger, you're an infantryman, and in retrospect, you're saying that was all part of a validation purpose to be valid, to be validated. Now you're in the Middle East, you're in combat.
Right.
I'm curious, what's going through your mind at that time?
Yeah, I mean, and again, back then I was a different person. I was like so looking forward to it. I was like, yes, war. I get to do the things I see on TV. But when we got there, it's so much different. I mean, like I've been very blessed with a lot of great military training, to include Ranger School. But there's this saying that the army, and I think it's fair to say the military all across the board, always trains to fight the last war. And so the training that we've gotten was perfect, but it was really meant for this conventional warfare, this kind of like this Cold War showdown in Europe or whatever else, with formations that wear uniform, that have a similar structure and similar equipment. And obviously that works super well in the first Gulf War. I mean, victory was achieved in the matter of a few weeks. And oh, by the way, in the first Gulf War, Iraqi army was like the third or the fourth largest in the world. And guess what? The same thing happened in the second Gulf War, in a sense that it only took a matter of weeks to overrun the regular forces, but the insurgency, nobody was ready for that. For example, like my unit, 82nd Airborne. So the standard mission of 82nd Airborne is to be able to deploy anywhere in the world within 18 hours. And so that meant getting on airplanes and parachuting in and doing airfield seizure operations. Basically, like you secure an airfield and then you just build out from there, because once you have an airfield, you can just fly all sorts of equipment, and you typically do it behind enemy lines, because that really gets into the enemy's decision cycle, which is basically inspired by Blitzkrieg, which was so effective in World War II. But where all of a sudden the enemy doesn't wear the uniform, you don't really know who the enemy is. You have intel, but then that intel, I mean, let's be honest, at the strategic level, everybody's heard that there were supposed to be nuclear weapons, and there weren't. So if that was the case at strategic level, think about the intel that you're getting at the tactical level. You get these targets, but then you look at them and you wonder, I mean, are these guys really terrorists? Because they could be, but are they really? And so it was just very hard, in a sense that we were definitely prepared for fighting kinetic war against enemy that was uniform. But what was so tough is to do that in an urban setting with civilians, and really not knowing who you're fighting or who might start the fight next, and making sure that you are not actually making the problem worse by creating terrorists, but based on your actions. And it's very hard. I mean, and especially when I was there, it was just after the invasion, so this was very new. Everyone was learning, and quite frankly, to this day, I'm still trying to reconcile what happened. And knowing what I know now, not that I've done anything criminal or evil, but I just know that if I knew what I know now, I would have approached things differently for sure.
You piqued my curiosity, and I I don't know if it's appropriate to ask you to dig a
Mm-hmm.
little deeper. Like, what does that
Sure.
mean? Like, what would be I
Sure.
cautiously ask, what would be
Yeah,
an
yeah, no,
example
no,
of
you know,
that?
no, it's
What
no
would be
worries.
an
Like with me,
example of how would you approach something different? Like you said, it was a new
yeah.
experience. It's a new class of warfare,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's safe to say. I think it's safe to say. I feel comfortable saying this that as veterans who have been a part of this conflict for now going on 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
it's safe to say that okay, so without with excuse my French, that it's kind of been a shit show. That being said, you know, what is an example
Mm-hmm.
of something you could have done different?
Yeah, sure. So like maybe I can give you an example of, like kind of like what I mentioned, just at a high level. So for example, I remember this one time, my platoon was supposed, so like, if you remember, like back at the beginning of the war, especially when we didn't have a lot of armored vehicles. For example, like what happened with us is we literally got Humvees with no armor from different units. Like we got some from our air defense artillery or some from support. So basically, all of a sudden we became motorized infantry. And back then there was no plates. We were just basically riding cargo Humvees, and the security was, guys facing out, and then
Yeah,
maybe
holy
putting
shit.
like heavy machine. Yeah, so and so what happened, especially in early wars, is that the insurgents, what they would do is they would grab artillery rounds and they would turn them into IEDs, and that was very, very simplistic but super effective, especially on vehicles that don't have much armor, because back then vast majority of the vehicles didn't. And so what was very important, like when that was happening, is to secure the ammo depots, because Saddam's didn't have the latest technology, but he had a lot of old school technology, kind of like the classic artillery, rounds that go into like artillery pieces, or tanks. And he had a whole bunch of these ammo places all over Iraq, because not only he was preparing himself for potential invasion, but also he was a dictator, so he had to have army forces all over Iraq spread out to be able to quell any type of unrest as needed. And so, for example, like my unit got the order to go into this one area, and I remember like the orders were is that if you saw somebody carrying these things, like our arm, like like artillery rounds, and if you can't get to them, you had to go ahead to shoot, because it's a likely conclusion that they were going to use it for bad purposes, even if they maybe not them directly, but they would eventually sell it to somebody who would, obviously it's not like you can eat artillery round. And so for example, this one time I went in there, we couldn't get to the vehicle, and I ordered my guys to shoot, and they shot, the vehicle stopped, we come over, and then you see this like regular guy, I mean, like like bullets all over the place, bullet holes, and you know, to this day, I'll never forget this. Like, I thought this guy was dead. And you know what he did? He said, "Mr. Cigarette, cigarette," and long story short, we were able to get him to like a med station that patched him up. But here's where the conundrum comes into place. Well, I did what I was supposed to do. Oh, and then the other thing is that when I told my company commander, he'd actually praised me. "Oh, this is fantastic, great job, great job," which again, like you can we look at it from both sides, because yes, let's say he was a terrorist, or he had an idea, he was going to sell. Yeah, I did the thing, but like, what if it was just some parent, you're a parent, most listeners are, if your kids are hungry, you can imagine after an invasion it's hard to get food. Like maybe he was going to sell it for money, and and so like all these thoughts kind of come back. It's like, well, like it's just such a mess. There's like there's no like clear solution in all these cases. So those are the kind of things that looking back, like bother me, is like, hey, did I actually help, or did I contribute to the problems? And so, to answer you specifically, what I would have done, I wish, knowing what I know now, and I know that the army gotten a lot better since on this, For example, like that's why General Petraeus, when he started took over Iraq, things changed. It took a few years for a lot of smart men didn't pick up on it, but like knowing what I know now, I would have done a better job of finding ways not to use force. And I wish that I would have spent more time on the relationships, because there's this saying that to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And because like whenever you do training, you kind of like shoot at the targets, and whenever you drill, you have your guys wear pretend enemy uniforms. So it's always like, how can I increase my lethality and decrease my exposure to the enemy? How can I kill more enemy and decrease my exposure? And so that's kind of the mindset that we have, which is perfect when you're fighting an enemy that fights by the same rules. But when all of a sudden you fight with an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms, it gets really messy. And unfortunately for our armed forces, it took us a good few years to figure it out. Eventually we did with General Petraeus. And especially looking back, and it seems like Iraq is probably gonna be okay. But when I look at Afghanistan, I mean, I wish them all the best, but then it's pretty almost certain that Afghanistan is gonna fall in a matter of months. And this is, oh, by the way, our longest fought war. And so it's like, was this worth all this trouble and treasure? I don't know. And so that's why looking back, it makes me wonder, because I was part of it.
I think what you're kind of delving into right now, the space that you're delving into is something that a lot of veterans have a difficulty with, right? Because it's like, what was your contribution, right? What was your contribution? Was it honorable, or what? You just have all these questions arise, right? All these questions arise, sure. And unfortunately, I've heard another story similar to yours, where there's innocent loss of life in those circumstances, and it's not much consolation. But unfortunately, you in the moment, you really only have time to react, right? And that's what I learned, at least from this other story. I won't necessarily go into details about, because I don't have the person's permission. But it's also an unfortunate result, right? And to call it unfortunate comes well short of what it actually is, right?
Right.
But just out of curiosity, how are you doing with that now?
Well, what really helps me is that ever since I left the military, I've become a stronger Christian. And so that really helps me with forgiveness and forgiving myself, forgiving others. And so it's not something that has a, almost like a PTSD impact on me, but it's just something that it's like, man, I wish what I know now back then.
I want to make sure that I tread lightly here, because I'm not a trained professional. I don't know how I don't know how to have these discussions properly, per se. You and I can have a topic, but I don't necessarily want to make you feel uncomfortable. But so I asked the question: is that something that you still, does it bother you? That's still a poor choice of words. Is it something that still kind of comes up often, or is it happen less?
Yeah, so that typically comes around whenever I think about military service. It's not like I think think about it all the time or on my own, but for example, whenever I watch news, right now, like you kind of talk about, there's some news about Afghanistan. It just kind of makes me wonder, go back, and it kind of makes me remember. It's like, man, you're just such a what were you thinking? Because I used to be like, yeah, go to war, it's gonna be great, and you realize that and it's funny because it's tragic, because I remember like reading these things, how like war is a mess, because to me, like one of the best quotes, I forgot who it was, but one of the best quotes that I think summarizes my experience with war is that wars are easy to start, but they're very difficult to finish.
I've actually had this discussion with my kids, talking about Band of Brothers. And they have
Right.
those little interviews at the beginning of that show, if you've never seen it. And they're old men, right? And they're
Mhm.
recalling their experiences from World War II as if it was yesterday.
Right.
I was telling my kids, I was like, I want you to pay close attention to this, because this old man can recall those experiences as if it happened yesterday,
Right.
and it's still with him,
Right.
vivid, So, and I don't say that necessarily to discourage them from joining the military. I say that to make sure that they understand that there is a lot more truth behind your service. There's a little bit more to it than what you see in the movies. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here, because we did get into it kind of heavy. Since you separated from the service,
Mhm.
right? What are you doing now?
Yeah. So what happened after the service? I was still a different person back then. I was still kind of chasing that next accomplishment, and so I ended up getting a job with ExxonMobil because they were paying great money at the time. Oil and gas sector was doing well. I got to travel a lot, and obviously looking back at it, I was in with Exxon for 10 years. I learned a lot, but what really shook me up is that about 2 years in, I went through a very nasty divorce that, quite frankly, nearly killed me. It's kind of ironic in the sense that I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, but by far the closest I've came to harming myself, and was after my divorce. What ended up happening is my ex-wife cheated on me, and that was very hard, because I knew my marriage wasn't perfect, but that was like the last thing that I expected to happen, and so that was very hard on me. And as painful as it was exactly what I needed to rebuild, because up until then, I built things, but it was on a very shaky foundation. So like once all this crumbled, it made me really it really forced myself, and quite frankly, I thought this was my second chance to build things out the way I should have built them originally, the way I was meant to, they were meant to be built. And so that set off a long exploration. Didn't happen overnight. It took a good few years, but interest of time, what happened is that the more I kind of got to know myself, I realized that my calling is to start my own business. And so to me, I figured that the best way to collect all these experiences that I've had, good, bad, and ugly, is to transfer that into leadership coaching. And so what happened is in 2018, I quit my job and I committed myself to coaching full time. And now I'm super blessed to work with companies like Pinterest, Yelp, kind of like your mid-sized tech companies, and help the leaders grow and develop. And that's been very very rewarding for me, and I really enjoyed that.
I asked you a question during our pre-interview, and right now the answer escapes me, but so I'm going to ask you again. In your experience so far as a leadership coach, are companies seeking out people with military experience, do you think?
It depends. It depends. I think that some industries, how can I say, align better with military than others. I don't think any company discriminates against, but I think that, if you think about companies, each company has its own culture. And so, for example, like, oil and gas used to be a great fit for military folks, because it was very structured. It was very methodical. So that would, for example, for me, was a very easy transition. I think that like creative fields are probably not as full of veterans. It's not, again, I don't think it's because they're discriminating, but I think on average, or obviously I'm not trying to broad brush, but I think on average, veterans tend to be more comfortable with processes and systems. And so typically, like the startups or kind of the creative fields are not a common place that which you find veterans. I think that there are, how can I say, I think that there's still um, they're still trying to. There's just kind of like a sense of figuring out how to use veterans. I think some companies are better than others. I think that some of them, they have the right intentions, but they don't feel fully equipped, or they don't know how to integrate veterans. Because if you think about it, look at an average tech company versus somebody who's like an infantryman. Like, well, I mean, there's definitely overlaps, but it's not intuitive. And so a lot of times people have the right intentions, but they don't know how to integrate a veteran. So typically, we're all guilty of it. We tend to stick what we know, just like, as veterans, we tend to hang out with veterans, similar with the siblings who haven't served. If with all things being equal, or where they're not sure, they're gonna stick with somebody that's more like them, that has more experiences like them. And so typically in the companies and fields that there's not a lot of veterans, then they're gonna go with a non-veteran.
We haven't been talking very long, and you've already shared so much, and there's so much more to learn. Let me ask you one last question before. Actually, I have a couple more things I want to get into, but one thing for sure, I want to talk to you about your book a little bit, The Love-Driven Man. What's that all about? What inspired that?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote this book right after quitting my job. It helped me soul search and helped me to put my experience in perspective. So basically what it does, it helps the readers to look at their experiences from a Christian perspective. It helps them to identify those wounds. For example, in my case, that those wounds were from my grandfather. But as I talk to a lot of men, each man had that grandfather figure in their lives, whether it was dad, somebody else, and helps them identify them, so that way they can transform it. Because what happens is that if we don't deal with these emotions and then what happened in the past, it holds us back. It leads us to, if you look at the covers, like that choice versus love and control, is that if we don't deal with our wounds, they tend to control us. We feel less than. There are things that we're stuffing down, or places that we aren't willing to go. And so what the book is, helps you to look at yourself, identify those experiences, and then helps them to transform it from the place of love. Because once you transform them, then that's what makes you stronger. And actually, a lot of times, that's what really becomes your story, that makes you a lot more relatable and a lot more effective at whatever you're doing, whether that's being in corporate America, entrepreneur, or even a third grade teacher.
Wow. Now I really do have to buy this book, because especially when you talk about men exploring their feelings and emotions, right, you might as well be asking someone to scale a 50-foot wall vertically with nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, right? It's not the sexiest of subjects. That's why there's not a lot of books on there.
It's almost seems like an impossible task, but I'm definitely curious about what strategies you have, and I'm gonna buy your book.
Awesome. Thank you, for sure.
Because I don't know, I don't think I'm speaking for just myself, but there's definitely there's something that men can learn by and take away from exploring their experiences and their emotions and their feelings and whatnot, and just getting more familiar and knowing what drives some of your decision making. I know that's some of what you explore too.
True.
How's your book doing, by the way? Is it doing pretty good?
Well, so it's like everything means a funny story. So it was doing very well right before COVID hit. And then, nowadays it's like whenever I do a conference or a podcast, the sales pick up. But yeah, it was kind of like, I got like the #1 new release on Amazon, which is fantastic. But then literally like within a couple of weeks, the COVID hit, and that really took a lot of wind out of sails.
But you did hit some good news recently, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So it's kind of funny how like life works in mysterious ways. So long story short, this Polish publishing company reached out to me, and they actually gave me a publishing deal. So and by me a publishing deal, they actually pay you money, pay me in advance,
That's cool.
Because sometimes there are publishing companies, we'll publish your company and pay us $5,000. It's like, hold on a second, but this is the one that they actually pay you. And so it's actually going to be translated in Polish and released. They're targeting Christmas in Poland. So congratulations. Yeah, awesome, it's super cool. Because it's funny, because when I first tried to publish them, I reached out to some publishers. It was like cricket. So I was like, screw it, I'm gonna do it on my own through Amazon. And then I wasn't even looking for those guys, and they came out to me, and I was like, oh, awesome, good deal.
One last plug of information for your book. It's available on Amazon, but it's also available on Audible, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, because that's one thing I've noticed is like some guys is like, man, I just don't have time, or I'm a listener. No worries at all. Actually, the guy narrating this book is an Air Force veteran, and he's got that Morgan Freeman voice. So if you're into Audible, no worries at all. Please check it out. You won't be disappointed by the voice.
Marek, it's been a pleasure talking with you today, and I really wish we could continue talking, and we might have another conversation, offline at another time. There's one last question I was going to ask, which was, and you kind of hinted toward this in our previous conversation, which is, what's the message? What's the takeaway? What is something that you would like to pass on to our veterans?
Sure. So like what I'm really passionate about now is servant leadership, which apparently is an old concept that's been around from 70s. And the funny thing is that whenever I say servant leadership in the corporate sector, it kind of goes like a fart in a church, because, the senior leaders, they're like, hey, I didn't, pay my dues to be a servant. And then the young guys is like, hey, like I didn't, go to school so that way I can serve, So I'm still trying to figure out the wording that resonates, but the concepts that I teach, I might not call them servant leadership, but it's taking a look at situations from the other person's perspective and figuring out how can I best serve. And the common misconception with servant leadership is that, hey, being servant leadership is a pushover. No. A lot of times serving means saying no to something so you can say yes to something else. Or a lot of times, for example, like one of my key indicators that servant leadership is working is that you are not avoiding tough conversations. There's this fantastic quote by Tim Ferriss that says roughly that your success in life directly correlates to the number of uncomfortable conversations that you're willing to have. And so, servant leader doesn't say, oh, uncomfortable conversation, I'm walking away. No, servant leader says, hey, I know this uncomfortable conversation is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be awkward, but I know that when we get through it, we figure out what the root issue is. We can finally come up with a solution that's going to solve the problem, rather than stuff it down or be passive aggressive, or me just assume that this person is no good, so I need to fire them. You have to have a lot of patience, but in the long term, it is so much more fulfilling.
I'd have to agree. Marek, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for spending some time with me. Thank you for sharing so much of yourself. You've got such a fantastic story, lots of ups and downs, but it really sounds like you're on the uptick and you're doing really well. So congratulations for that. Congratulations on the success of your book. Congratulations on finding your passion, and good luck with that, by the way, and good luck with all the other things that we talked about too. It's not easy to watch the news nowadays and have your mind wander, especially as a veteran. So, best of luck to you in that area too. And you're always welcome to give me a call or shoot me a message sometime. If you find yourself in a tough spot, I'll give you at least an opportunity to vent if you have to.
Sure.
Right. So, but yeah, thank you very much for spending some time with me and sharing your story with me and my listeners. But thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Thank you for watching if you're watching on YouTube. I tell you what, Marek had a ton of interesting stuff to share, at least I thought. And I think a lot of us veterans can relate to Marek's experience as far as joining the service or wanting to be a part of something. In this case, joining the service because he wanted to be a part of something bigger than what he was. He wanted to be something greater than what he was. One of the observations that I made in my service, and I may have already mentioned this on the podcast, but one of the observations I made during my service is that it always seemed apparent to me that the men and women of the armed services, that 1% of the population that wear the uniform, they always looked at the world as bigger than what they were, right? They always looked at the world as something greater than what they were, and they always looked at, I say always, that's not necessarily accurate, but many of them, a large percentage of them, looked at the world as something greater than what they were. They saw it as something that needed their contribution, something that they wanted to contribute to, and Marek was just one of those people. So, and luckily for him, he also was able to look back on his experience in the military and realize that it was a matter of validation and a matter of belonging and whatnot. He worked through all that stuff, and it really sounds like he's doing okay. I think another thing that he shared that was very interesting, that I think that a lot of veterans can relate to, especially combat veterans, is that there can be a lot of conflicting thoughts that can creep into your mind after you've had some time to reflect on your experience. It sounds like he worked through it okay. He found some purpose, found some direction, and that sounds like what's helping him. If you're one of those folks who are having trouble with that sort of thing, make sure you're reaching out for some help, okay? Talk to a friend, talk to a buddy, talk to somebody you can trust. Always encourage people who are experiencing those types of issues to reach out for a mental health professional and talk to a mental health professional. I realize there's a stigma surrounding that, but I also can assure you from my own experience that it does pay good dividends. So, that being said, once again, thank you for tuning in to the Veterans Lounge podcast. I really, really appreciate it. Remember, you can watch the video of this interview on YouTube, and you can also listen to it everywhere now, everywhere you get your podcast, especially on Spotify, or iHeartRadio, iTunes, and Google Podcasts. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please go to veteransnexus.org/podcasts. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe, share it with somebody you know, someone you think might have a story to share of their own. Okay, I've droned on long enough. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll talk to you next week. God bless.